Mortals feared the rats and the fleas, those small vessels that carried the apocalypse in their blood. They burned aromatic herbs, locked their doors, and prayed to a god who seemed to have suddenly gone deaf. They feared the black buboes, the fever, the death that came in a matter of days. But as I walked the empty streets of Florence in 1348, feared something much worse. I feared the silence that came after the final breath to a being like me, who measures existence in centuries. Humanity is a symphony, noisy, chaotic, often dissonant, but always vibrant. The sound of 1,000 beating hearts, the buzz of the markets, the laughter in the taverns, the cry of newborns. But the Black Death, the great mortality, was turning this symphony into a monotonous requiem. The only constant sound was that of the church bells, ringing incessantly for the dead, a funereal hammering that counted the reaped souls, until there was no one left to pull the ropes, and an even deeper silence would settle. I walked through a world that had become my mirror, a world of ghosts, abandoned carriages rotted in the streets, their dead horses still harnessed. Doors marked with a red cross were like open wounds on the face of the city. Smell. The gods, if they existed, would have wept at the smell. It was a nauseating mix of death and despair, the sweet, heavy odor of decomposing bodies piled in the streets, the acrid stench of the funeral pyres that burned day and night, and the smell of vinegar and herbs that the living used in a vain attempt to purify the air. It was a miasma that clung to the fog, making the very act of breathing a reminder of death, even for someone like me who needs no air. My dilemma was a cruel irony. I, the immortal, the nocturnal predator, walked among piles of corpses, a creature of death in an empire of death, and yet I was untouchable. The disease passed through me like water over a stone. I was the only living being who could not die, in a city where life had become the exception. This immunity was not a blessing. It was the most exquisite form of loneliness. I saw entire families disappear in a week, saw love turn to terror when a mother had to abandon her sick child. I saw faith disintegrate, priests refusing to give last rites, men becoming beasts for a piece of bread. And I just watched. An eternal statue in a garden of decaying flesh. It was during one of these twilight walks that I began to feel it. It was not the disease. It was something else. A low hum at the base of my consciousness, a vibration of malevolence that seemed to nestle in the darkest places. Vague. I saw the victims of the plague, the buboes and the fever, but there was something more in their eyes in the final moments. A void. A horror so absolute that it seemed to have consumed their souls long before their hearts stopped. It was as if the disease were just the vessel, and a much darker passenger was on board. That was when I saw them for the first time. They moved through the twilight like birds of ill omen. The plague doctors, monks or healers, dressed in long coats of waxed leather, gloves, and their terrible bird-beak masks, filled with herbs to filter the miasma. They were a nightmarish sight, but they had become common. However, there was a group among them that moved differently, quieter, more deliberate. Their masks seemed to hide more than just their faces. One night I followed one of them. He did not enter a house to offer comfort or healing. He entered an alley where an entire family lay dead, abandoned. Through my sharp vision, I saw him kneel, not to pray, but to murmur. And as he murmured, I felt that hum again, stronger. It was as if his words were feeding the darkness, inviting it to feast. He dipped his finger into one of the black buboes of a corpse and, huge with the putrid fluid, drew a symbol on the stone wall, a spiral that seemed to squirm, as if it were alive. I felt a cold that did not come from the night air. The fear humans felt was of bodily death. My fear was of something eternal. That spiral, that dirge. I had seen it before, in ancient and forgotten texts, linked to entities that do not cause death, but consume it. Entities that feed on the echo of despair. The plague was not just a biological disease. Someone, or something, was using it, cultivating it. And for the first time in centuries, in the midst of a dying world, I, the immortal, felt the touch of true fear. The city was not just dying, it was being harvested. The masked acolyte was gone, vanishing into the fog as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the echo of his murmurs and that pulsating symbol on the wall. I approached, curiosity overcoming the primordial revulsion I felt. The spiral, drawn with the black ichor of a dead man, seemed alive under the moonlight. It was not just an image. It was a sigil, an anchor, gateway. I could feel the energy emanating from it, a low, sickening frequency that resonated with the hum I felt in my mind. It was a note in the city's funeral dirge, and I knew there were others, thousands of them, hidden in alleys, cellars, and sick rooms, weaving a web of despair over Florence, my centuries-old apathy. The armor that immortality forges around the heart had shattered. Bigness was not a simple reaping of souls. It was a spiritual infestation, and I needed to understand its origin. The hunt began. I no longer searched for warm veins in the shadows, but for those birds of black leather. I spent the days in a self-imposed torpor, hidden in forgotten crypts beneath the churches, and emerged with the twilight to become yet another ghost in the ghost city. I followed several of them. Most were what they appeared to be, terrified men doing a horrific job, their masks filled with vinegar and fear, not malevolence. But the group I sought was different. They moved with a purpose, a silence that was not of fear, but of reverence. Their steps did not falter before the bodies. Their gestures were ritualistic. I chose one, the tallest, whose presence seemed to be a stronger nexus for the whisper, and I became his shadow. The pursuit led me through the rotting heart of Florence. Here, we crossed the Ponte Vecchio, whose vibrant shops were now just wooden sepulchres with their doors shut. We reached the banks of the Arno. The river, normally an artery of life and commerce, had become a liquid mass grave. Bloated bodies floated slowly towards the sea, their pale limbs in a macabre embrace. The acolyte stopped for a moment, not to mourn, but to observe, like a farmer inspecting his crop. Then he continued on. His destination was a monastery on the city's outskirts, a bastion of dark stone that seemed immune to the decay on the outside. The gates were locked, but to me, walls are mere invitations. Scaled, the stone wall with the ease of a spider, moving through the shadows of gargoyles that seemed to weep tears of soot. What I found inside would freeze the blood of even the most devout of men. In the scriptorium, where monks should have been copying holy scriptures, a scene of ordered horror was unfolding. Under the candlelight, a dozen acolytes now, without their bird masks, worked in silence. Their faces were emaciated, their eyes shining with a fanatical fervor. They were not copying the Bible. In large tomes of parchment, they were inscribing, with meticulous calligraphy, the names of the plague's victims, and next to each name, they drew the spiral. It was a great ledger of death, a catalogue of the harvest of souls, hidden in the dark rafters above. I heard the voice of their leader, an aged abbot whose face was a map of sickening ecstasy. "The great mortality is not a punishment," he told his followers. "It is a purification. The flesh is weak, a noisy and dirty vessel for the soul. The whisper has offered us a gift. It has taught us that the true paradise is not heaven, but silence. the stillness of the soul liberated from its prison of flesh. He was speaking of the entity. He saw it as a god. Played, they were not just its servants, they were its prophets. They were not just recording death, they were spreading it. Their beaks, I realized with horror, were not filled only with herbs. They carried contaminated powders and fluids, not just with the Yersinia pestis bacterium, sir, but with the essence of the whisper itself, carrying the spiritual infection from house to house under the guise of medicine. The harvest is almost complete, the abbot continued, and my cold blood seemed to run even colder. Kit. But the final sacrifice is needed to seal the pact and ensure the age of silence. The last pure light of the city must be extinguished so that the darkness may be absolute. He then uttered a name that made me hold the breath I did not need. Beatrice Portinari, the lady of the Villa. Her family is isolated, untouched by the plague. Her soul shines like a beacon of hope for the fools who still pray. Tomorrow, we will visit her. We will bring her our remedy and offer her as the bride of silence. A new horror seized me. It was no longer about understanding the nature of the evil that plagued Florence. Now, it had a name, a face, a target. The acolytes were not just going to kill another person. They were planning a ritual, a human sacrifice to consolidate the power of their profane entity over the dying city. I left the monastery before dawn, the abbot's voice echoing in my mind. I did not know who Beatrice Portinari was, but her name was now engraved on my consciousness. The prophets of death had a plan, and I had until the next sunset to become the guardian angel of a woman I had never met. Dawn tinted, the sky a sickly gray, the light struggling to pierce the shroud of smoke and fog that suffocated Florence. I moved through the streets with a new purpose. The boredom of centuries had been replaced by the urgency of a hunter whose prey is not a target, but a goal to be protected. Why did I care? That question echoed in my mind. It was not altruism, an emotion that had long ago become an unsustainable luxury for my kind. It was, perhaps, a matter of balance. The acolytes and their hungry god represented absolute chaos, annihilation by entropy. I, in my long and unchanging existence, was a creature of order, even if it was a predatory order. To protect this woman, Beatrice Portinari was to protect one of the last vestiges of order in a world that was falling apart. It was an act of defiance against the void. The journey out of the city was a passage through circles of hell. I left behind the streets crowded with the dead and climbed the hills that surrounded Florence. With every step the air became cleaner, the smell of death replaced by the scent of pine trees and damp earth. From above, the city looked like a purulent wound on the beautiful landscape of Tuscany, with columns of black smoke rising like the last breaths of a dying giant. The Villa Scarlata, as the name suggested, was a deep red, the color of sun-warmed terracotta. It was an island of life in an ocean of pestilence. Its walls were high, and I could see armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Not against an army, but against the desperation of the hungry and the sick who might try to force their way in. I waited for twilight, my natural hour. The transition from day to night was my veil, galed the southern wall, silent as the shadow itself, and entered the gardens. Inside, order reigned. Olive and cypress trees stood in perfect rows. Fountains murmured softly, a sound almost forgotten amidst the sepulchral silence of the city below. But the peace was an illusion. It was the tense peace of a besieged fortress. I found her in the inner courtyard, under an ivy-covered arch. Was not a fragile damsel, locked in her ivory tower. She was kneeling on the stone floor, wiping the forehead of a feverish child with a damp cloth. Several other people, servants, perhaps a few lucky refugees, rested on makeshift mattresses around her. Sia she had not only isolated herself from the plague, she had created a sanctuary. Her face, illuminated by the soft light of lanterns, was of a serene beauty, but her eyes held a wisdom and a sadness that belied her youth. She was, indeed, a light, and I understood why the acolytes coveted her. Care to extinguish a light like that would be the final victory for their darkness. I approached, my steps muffled by the grass. The guards did not see me. The child fell asleep, and she stood up, exhausted. That's when she felt me. She turned, not with a scream, but with a sharp gasp, her hand to her chest. "Who's there?" Her voice was firm, despite the shock. "A friend," I replied, stepping out of the shadows, "though you have no reason to believe me." She examined me, her eyes scanning my pale face, my dark clothes that belonged to no local nobleman. "My guards did not see you enter. Are you a thief or a ghost?" "Neither," I said. "I am a warning. The plague that ravages the city has servants, a cult of men who disguise themselves as doctors, but who worship death itself. They believe you are a symbol, a flame of hope they need to extinguish to complete their dark work." She stared at me, skeptical, but something in my stillness, in the contained urgency of my voice, made her hesitate. "Fanatics. Amidst this horror, madness blooms in many gardens," she said, more to herself. "They are not just mad," I insisted. "They are organized. And they will come for you. Tonight. Why should I trust a stranger who sprouts from the shadows to tell me nightmare tales?" "Because you have already felt it," I said, taking a step closer. "You have felt the darkness deepening out there. It is not just the disease. There is something else in the air. A hopelessness that is almost a physical presence. I did not come to tell a nightmare tale. I came to try to prevent it from having its final chapter here." Her eyes, a deep blue like the night sky, probed mine. For a long moment she was silent, the decision weighing upon her. She, a woman of faith and reason, and I, a creature of the night and of secrets. Finally, she nodded. "What do you suggest we do? Reinforce the gates, arm every able-bodied man, extinguish all external lights. They will come under the cloak of night, expecting to find a sleeping household." We spent the next few hours in a feverish activity. Her trust in me, however fragile, convinced her men. Barricades were erected. Crossbows were armed. The villa transformed from a sanctuary into a fortress. As night fell, bringing with it the cold mist from the hills, Beatrice and I found ourselves in the great hall. The tapestries on the walls seemed to watch us with their faded thread eyes. "Cor, you fight like a soldier, but you speak like a philosopher," she said. "Who are you?" "I am someone who believes that even in the darkest night, a single candle is worth defending," I replied, the truth in my words being deeper than she could ever imagine. Then the sound came, a lone bell, ringing in the dead city below, marking the hour, and shortly after, another sound, coming from the dark gardens of the villa itself. A low, rhythmic chant, a guttural murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself. The acolytes of silence had arrived. The siege was about to begin. The chant that rose from the gardens was not human. It was the sound of wasps in a hive of bones, a guttural, multifaceted hum that seeped through the cracks of the barricades and seemed to make the very air vibrate. It was not just sound, it was a weapon. I felt it as a pressure in my mind, the collective voice of the whisper channeled through its prophets, projecting waves of pure despair. I saw the faces of Beatrice's guards turn pale, the bravery in their eyes being corroded by an irrational dread. The hands holding the crossbows began to tremble. Beatrice, standing beside me, placed a hand on her chest, her face tense. "What sorcery is this?" she whispered. "It is their lullaby," I replied, my calm voice a counterpoint to the cacophony. "They want fear to do their work for them before they even attack." Then the first projectile cut through the night sky. It was not a stone or a flaming arrow. With a sickening, wet thud, a human body, swollen and blackened by the plague, was hurled over the wall by an improvised catapult, splattering across the inner courtyard. A collective scream of horror rose from the defenders. It was biological and psychological warfare. More bodies followed. A macabre rain that brought not only contagion but the message that death outside was inevitable and would soon be inside. "Hold your positions," Beatrice shouted, her voice rising above the panic. "Do not let their terror break you." Her strength was remarkable, a stubborn flame against a howling wind. But I knew that mortal courage had its limits. As the guards, overcoming their horror, began to fire their crossbows at the shadows moving in the garden, I slipped into the darkness of the courtyard. It was time for the predator to join the fray. Too, the men on the walls. I was a blur, a gust of wind that brought death. To the acolytes. I was a nightmare they could not have conceived in their sick philosophy. The first one who met me among the olive trees raised a torch, his eyes widening behind the bird mask. Squit, before a sound could escape his throat, his head was twisted at an unnatural angle. I moved among them like the plague itself, silent, fast, and lethal. They were driven by a fanatical fervor, ignoring wounds that would have felled ordinary men. But they could not fight what they could not clearly see. A broken neck here, a shattered spine there. I used no weapons, only the strength of centuries and the cold fury of a disturbed order. Despite my efforts, they were many. Like a swarm of insects, they advanced, ignoring their losses, and focused their attack on the great oak gate. The sound of an improvised battering ram began to echo. Each beat a nail in the villa's coffin. The abbot, I realized, was not among the combatants. He remained at the back of the garden, his voice leading the chant. The epicenter of the profane energy that fueled his followers. The key was the heart of the serpent. With a deafening crack, the gate gave way. The acolytes poured into the courtyard like a wave of darkness, their grotesque masks and black robes a vision from hell. The battle was now hand to hand, a desperate clash of steel and faith against fanaticism and rot. From an upper window, Beatrice commanded, her clear and precise voice directing the remaining defenders, while she herself fired a crossbow into the invading tide. My path was clear. I left the defense of the courtyard to the mortals and focused on the prize. Icapa through the chaos, a spectre of contained violence, moving towards the abbot. The acolytes tried to stop me, but they were like waves breaking against a rock. The abbot saw me coming. His eyes, visible through the holes in his mask, widened. He saw what I was. He saw that the death he worshipped had come for him personally. But he was cunning. Seeing that the physical strength of his followers was useless against me, he changed tactics. When I was just a few feet away, he stopped the physical attack. Kit, he raised his hands, not at me, but towards the window where Beatrice stood. The chant changed, becoming a sharp, piercing lament, focused on a single note. He was no longer attacking the villa. He was attacking her soul. I saw Beatrice falter. She dropped the crossbow, her hands going to her head. A scream of pure agony escaped her lips, but there was no wound on her body. Her eyes rolled back, and she fell to her knees. Xer, I could feel the energy of the whisper, focused by the abbot, enveloping her, trying to rip out her essence, to extinguish her light from the inside out. The physical battle was almost won, but the spiritual one was about to be lost. I stood between the prophet of death and the woman I had sworn to protect, and I had to make a choice: advance and silence the serpent's heart, or turn back to protect a soul that was being actively devoured before my eyes. And, for the first time in a long time, I did not know which path would lead to anything but ruin. Beatrice's scream was not a sound of physical pain, but of something much deeper shattering. It was the sound of a soul being torn. Before me, the abbot, with his hands raised, was a grotesque puppet, and the whisper was the puppet master pulling the strings of her existence. My mind, forged in millennia of survival, calculated the odds in an instant. To go to her would be a defensive act. I could perhaps create a barrier with my own will, but that would leave me vulnerable and leave the source of the attack intact. A predator does not defend. It attacks. The only way to stop the song was to silence the singer. I made my decision. The world around me seemed to slow down. The chaos of the courtyard, the screams of men, the clash of steel, all became a blur, background noise to my true purpose. I moved, to mortalize. I must have disappeared from one place and reappeared in another. I crossed the courtyard, a spectre of vengeance, my path marked by the bodies of the acolytes who dared to stand in my way. They were no longer adversaries, savor, mere obstacles, dry branches breaking under the onslaught of a much older force. As I approached the abbot, he did not retreat. He turned his attention to me. The attack on Beatrice did not cease, but now I felt the full force of his dark will focusing on me. It was not a physical force, Kit. It was a wave of pure nihilism, the crushing weight of the whisper's philosophy. I felt the despair of the entire city projected into my mind, the pain of the dying, the loneliness of the survivors, the final silence of the dead. It was a weapon designed to break the spirit, to convince any being that existence was an anomaly and silence, the only truth. A mortal mind would have disintegrated, turned to dust, but my mind is not mortal. It is a fortress built with the stones of fallen empires, cemented with the memories of forgotten eras. I already knew silence, a cosmic and lonely silence that would make the abbot's entity seem like a petulant child. I let the wave of despair crash against me, and then I returned it, not with despair, but with something much worse, with my truth. I opened a small fissure in my consciousness and showed the abbot a glimpse of what I am, Sipwe. I showed him the fall of Rome, not as history, but as a memory from yesterday afternoon. I showed him the sands of Egypt when the pyramids were still young. I showed him the cold, unchanging hunger of a being who has seen stars born and die and who has always survived. I showed him a loneliness so vast and ancient that his age of silence seemed a fleeting, insignificant moment. I saw the terror bloom in his eyes behind the mask, the faith that sustained him, the belief in his dark God, shattered against the reality of a being far older and infinitely more terrible. His connection to the whisper faltered. The chant in his mind became a scream of panic. The pressure on Beatrice's soul slackened. It was the opening I needed. In the blink of an eye, I was before him. His mouth opened to utter one last blasphemy, or perhaps a plea, but I did not grant him the sound. My hand closed on his throat, and with a grip that held the strength of centuries of hunting, I crushed his larynx. The chanting ceased. The psychic hum that hung over the villa dissipated instantly. The effect on the acolytes was immediate and catastrophic. With their leader dead and the power that bound them gone, the fanatical fervor in their eyes was replaced by the primal terror of mortal men. They were no longer prophets. They were just men in strange costumes, trapped in a courtyard full of enemies. Some dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, babbling. Others tried to flee, only to be cut down by Beatrice's guards, who, sensing the shift in the tide of battle, advanced with a cry of vengeance. I left them behind and ran to the hall. Beatrice was on the floor, unconscious, but breathing. Storm in her soul had passed. The siege was over. As the first rays of a timid, sickly sun began to touch the tops of the cypress trees, I stood in a blood-stained courtyard, surrounded by carnage. The battle was won. The surviving guards looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and profound dread. Xli. They did not know what I was, but they knew I was not one of them. Beatrice began to stir, a moan escaping her lips. Xi. She would wake soon, in a world where she knew that monsters were real, and that her savior was one of them. Inside, I had protected the candle, but to do so, I had to reveal the nature of my own darkness. The sun was rising, forcing me to retreat into the villa's shadows. The night of fighting was over, but the long and uncertain journey of what would come next was just beginning. The sunlight seeping through the barricaded windows was, to me, a threat as real as the act, while Beatrice's servants, exhausted and in shock, began the macabre work of clearing the courtyard. I retreated to the depths of the villa, to the cool, dark wine cellar, where the smell of aged wine and damp earth was a balm to my overwhelmed senses. There, among oak barrels and dusty bottles, I entered the state of torpor that mortals call sleep. For me, it is an immersion into the silent ocean of memory, a place where time folds in on itself. But, for the first time in centuries, my rest was disturbed. The image of Beatrice's face contorted in spiritual agony, and the echo of my own will crashing against the void of the whisper remained on the surface of my consciousness. Kaya had saved her, but at a cost. The veil between our worlds had been torn. When the following night spread its mantle over the hills of Tuscany, I emerged. GIF. The villa was silent, but it was a different silence from the city's. It was a silence of mourning and recovery. I found Beatrice in her scriptorium, a small circular room at the top of one of the towers, surrounded by books and maps. She was not reading. Shiv was standing by an open window, looking out at the dark wound that was Florence, where the funeral pyres still burned like fallen stars. She felt my presence before I said a word. "I knew you would come," she said, without turning. "My men looked for you this morning. They said you ... vanished." "The sun is no friend of mine," I replied simply, stopping at a respectful distance. She finally turned. Her face was pale, and there were new shadows under her eyes, but her expression was not one of fear. It was of an intense and solemn curiosity. "Duo during the battle, when that man did what he did," she began, her voice faltering. I felt my soul being pulled into an abyss of silence. But then I felt something else. A presence, vast, cold, ancient, but not empty. It was like a mountain, refusing to be moved by the storm. "It was you." I did not deny it. Lies and disguises had become useless between us. "What are you, Shah?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like stardust. "Kamek." "I am ancient," I answered, the truth in its simplest form. "I am a constant in a world of variables. What you felt was my will, bought. What that abbot channeled was the chaos of the end. And my nature abhors chaos. An angel," she whispered, testing the word. A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Hartley, Lady Angels do not hunt in the shadows. Let's just say I am a predator of a different order, and those acolytes invaded my hunting grounds with their filth." She pondered my words, her intelligent mind connecting the dots I left in the subtext. "So, that ... thing, the whisper, it's still out there. It has lost its prophets, but the entity itself has not been destroyed. It is like the plague itself. You can burn the bodies, but the disease remains in the air, waiting for new hosts. The whisper feeds on the despair the plague creates. As long as the city dies, it will grow stronger. Then we must give the city hope, she said, a glint of defiance in her eyes. We cannot fight the disease with swords, but perhaps we can fight the despair with knowledge. She moved to a large oak table, where an ancient map of Florence was spread out. These acolytes, with their rituals and symbols, they were not acting randomly. They were creating a web, and every web has a center. She pointed to the map. The ancient chronicles of my family speak of ages of darkness, of plagues that came before, and of places in the city that are ... weak, places where the veil between worlds is thinner. Ceped, the abbot, must have discovered these texts. He was trying to create a nexus, a focal point to permanently anchor the whisper to this world. A new plan began to form, born from the union of her wisdom and my strength. She, with her knowledge of the city's secrets, and I, with my ability to walk through its darkest and most dangerous veins. We need to find this nexus, I said, my voice an echo of hers. We need to find the heart of their web and destroy it. That would mean going back, she said, the weight of those words hanging between us, back to the epicenter of death and madness. Our gazes met over the candlelit map. We were no longer a stranger and a lady, a monster and a victim. We were allies, bound by a night of terror and a common purpose. She was the light, the strategist, the soul of the mission. And I would be her weapon in the darkness. They tried to extinguish your light. Beatrice, I said, using her first name for the first time. Now, we will use that same light to burn their darkness to ash. The night of the siege was over, but the true war, the war for the soul of Florence, was about to begin, and we would both walk into the heart of it, together. The day that followed our alliance was an interlude of silence and feverish preparation, while I retreated to the protective darkness of the cellar, feeling my strength consolidate after the battle. Beatrice entrenched herself in her scriptorium. Through our strange connection, I could feel her, not as a physical presence, but as a mind on fire, a light of intellect scouring ancient tomes and faded maps, hunting for the secret geography of Florence. She was not looking for streets or squares, but 4 lines of power, ancient scars on the land where history had left wounds that never fully healed. When night fell and I emerged, she was waiting for me. Her eyes shone with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "I found it," she said, her voice low. "It's not an obvious place, not one of the great cathedrals. It's something much older." She spread a map on the table, the parchment yellowed and fragile. "Under the Ospedale di San Giovanni di Dio, one of the oldest hospitals in the city. Before it was a Christian hospital, the chroniclers say there was a Roman temple there, dedicated to Februis, the god of purification through death. Dia, the church built over it, trying to seal the place's energy, but never fully succeeded. It is a place saturated by centuries of pain and death. It is the perfect soil for their garden." The descent back into Florence was a journey into hell. The city, in just 2 days, had deteriorated even further. The silence was heavier, the stench thicker. The funeral pyres had been extinguished in some neighborhoods for lack of men to feed them. Bodies lay where they fell. What little civilization remained had crumbled. We saw groups of flagellants parading through the empty squares, their chants echoing ghost-like as they whipped themselves in a desperate search for penance. We saw men with eyes glazed by hunger, scavenging the dead for anything of value. I moved like a shroud, keeping Beatrice in the shadows with me. She learned quickly, her steps becoming silent. Her breath held a small vial of aromatic oils under her nose, a fragile barrier against the smell of death, but her gaze never wavered. The fear was there. I could feel it in her racing pulse, but it was coated in a layer of determination as hard as steel. She was no longer the lady of the villa. She was a soldier in enemy territory. The hospital was a nightmarish sight. A mountain of bodies was piled near the entrance, awaiting the death carts that might never arrive. Plague doctors, the real ones and perhaps some of the remaining acolytes, moved like vultures among the dying who lined the corridors. Using Beatrice's blueprint, we found a forgotten entrance to the crypts at the back, a stone door hidden behind a wall of ivy. The air that flowed out when I opened the door was ancient and vile. It was a cold that came not from the stone, but from the very absence of life and hope. We descended into the darkness with only the light of a single lantern. The crypts were a labyrinth of low corridors and niches containing the bones of past generations, and everywhere, on the walls, on the ceilings, on the bones themselves, was the symbol. Thousands of spirals, drawn with the same sick, black ichor, all pulsating with a weak, malevolent energy, like the heartbeat of a dying being. The psychic pressure was overwhelming. It was the sound of the whisper, no longer a hum, but a silent roar that screamed in our minds. Finally, we reached the heart. It was not a ritual chamber with an altar. It was a natural cave beneath the hospital's foundations. In the center, an ancient fountain, the fountain of the Roman temple, bubbled not with water, but with a thick black sludge. And in the middle of the sludge, floating in a profane suspension, were the remains of a single ancient body, covered in petrified buboes, perhaps the first victim of a forgotten plague. The patient zero that served as the entity's physical anchor. The entire place pulsed with the voice of the whisper, a cacophony of all the despair, pain, and fear that Florence had suffered. We knew what we had to do. Beatrice took from her bag a flask of Greek fire, a highly volatile alchemical mixture she had prepared. Purification by fire, she had said. It was the only way. But as we approached the fountain, the cacophony in our minds ceased, and it was replaced by a single, seductive voice, a voice that did not scream, but spoke with an intimate and gentle clarity, directly into our souls. "Stop," said the voice, sounding like a loving father. "Why fight? Suffering is the only constant in life. Pain, fear, loss, they are the only certainties. I offer the true balm, the gift of silence, the end of all pain. The voice addressed Beatrice. "Little flame, you fight so hard. Let your light rest. Join the stillness. There will be no more fear, no more grief, only peace." And then it addressed me, and you, eternal wanderer. So tired, so lonely. How many centuries of painful memories do you carry? How many losses? Silence can be your sanctuary. An eternity, not of loneliness, but of nothingness. The end of the burden. The rest you can never find in death. The offer hung in the cold air of the crypt. It was not a threat. It was a temptation, the most dangerous of all, for it attacked not our bodies, but our deepest wounds. For a moment, the idea of peace, of an end to my endless, solitary vigil, was as seductive as the warmest blood. I saw Beatrice falter, the weight of all she had endured nearly bringing her to her knees. The final enemy was not a monster to be fought with fire and steel. It was a promise, and before we could destroy the heart of the darkness, we had to first conquer the darkness within ourselves. The voice of the whisper was like honey and opium, a lullaby for a weary soul. For an eternal moment, the promise of peace, of an end to my endless vigil, was the most seductive thing I had ever known. The weight of millennia, of empires seen to rise and ruin, of loves lost to the dust of time, it could all simply ... cease. I saw the temptation in Beatrice's eyes as well, burden of leading, of being the sole rock in a sea of despair, almost broke her. I saw the promise of rejoining her lost family, of ending the pain, nearly extinguished the flame in her eyes. It was she who moved first. With a tremor that ran through her entire body, she raised her head, her eyes, which for a moment had grown dull with the promise of the void, ignited with a defiant fury. "Silence," she said, her voice echoing in the cave, no longer faltering, but resonating with the strength of a cathedral bell. Silence is what you offer the dead, but life, even in its pain, has music. The suffering you despise is the soil where courage grows. Loss is what gives love its value. We do not want your empty peace." Her words were like a gust of fresh wind in my stagnant mind. She, a mortal with her short and fragile life, was teaching me a lesson I had forgotten. Life is not about the absence of pain, but about the meaning found within it. The Whisper's offer was not peace, it was annihilation. I, Lysander, am the personification of persistence. I am the living memory, the witness who refuses to forget. To surrender to nothingness would be the only true death. Your peace is the peace of a tomb. My own voice sounded cold and hard as granite, and I have spent far too much time in tombs to desire one as my home. The entity shrieked, too. The gentle voice was gone, replaced by a howl of frustrated rage and hunger that shook the very foundations of the crypt. The black sludge in the fountain boiled violently, but the window of opportunity was closing. "Now, Beatrice," Guy shouted. She acted grit. With a swift, fluid motion, she uncorked the flask of Greek fire and hurled it. The clay flask shattered against the ancient corpse in the center of the fountain. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, with a hissing sound, the black sludge erupted. Unholy green flames, which fed not on air but on the very corrupt essence of the place, soared to the ceiling of the cave. The psychic howl turned into a scream of unimaginable agony, the sound of 1,000 tortured souls being released and consumed at once. Tictu spirals on the walls glowed brightly and then shattered into dust. The heart of the web was being incinerated. We had to flee. The heat was intense, and the entire cave began to tremble, rocks falling from the ceiling. We ran back through the labyrinth of crypts, the ghastly green light of the pyre chasing us. Soot. When we emerged into the Florentine night, panting and covered in soot, the air was different. The plague was still there, death still loomed, but the spiritual pressure, the crushing weight of despair that had suffocated the city, had lifted. It was as if the city, even in its agony, could finally breathe again. We returned to the Villa Scarlotta before the dawn could claim me. There was no celebration, only an exhausted, shared silence. The plague would not disappear overnight. It would take months, years, for its physical wounds to heal, but we had torn the parasite from its soul. We knew that, without the unifying power of the Whisper, the remaining acolytes would scatter, becoming just isolated madmen, no longer an army. As the next night fell, I knew my time there was over. I found Beatrice in the same courtyard where we first met. The full moon illuminated her face, and for the first time I saw a glimpse not of the soldier, but of the woman, tired but whole. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. "My place is in the shadows," I confirmed. "Cage, and yours is here, in the light. They will need you to rebuild, to remind them how to hope." "And who will remind me?" she whispered, the only vulnerability she allowed herself. "You do not need reminders," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You are hope, the flame that refused to go out." There was no touch, No prolonged farewell, just a nod. A silent acknowledgment between two beings from different worlds who had shared a night in hell and emerged transformed. I turned and merged with the darkness, leaving her behind. A solitary figure bathed in the moonlight thought today. Centuries later, here in this cafe in Salvador, the warmth of the sun on my face, I remember Beatrice Portinari. She survived. She became a beacon for Florence during the slow, painful reconstruction. Her villa a center of healing and knowledge. Her name passed into history not as a victim, but as a leader. Humanity, as always, repeats its mistakes. I see plagues of different natures sweep the modern world. Plagues of hatred, of ignorance, of indifference. But then I remember that woman, a fragile mortal who faced a god of despair and won. Not with strength, but with the stubborn refusal to stop fighting for the music of life. And I, the eternal wanderer, who once feared only silence, learned from her that true power is not in surviving the darkness, but in carrying the memory of the light. And that, of all my long and countless memories, is the one I refuse to let die.